Hello and welcome to the Construction Industry Institute's webinar, the COVID-19 Workforce Challenge, Strategies to Manage Your Workforce to Come Out Stronger in Recovery. As part of our COVID-19 webinar series, we wanted to do a deep dive into the people-related challenges currently disrupting organizations involved in capital-intensive construction projects and present several recommendations to help you overcome workforce management challenges and envision the workforce of the future in anticipation of a post-pandemic rebound. CII members asked for this topic, and we want you to know that we're listening to you. I'm Mike Pappas, CII's Associate Director of Deployment. This session is being recorded, so please keep your microphones muted and you hold your questions until the end of the presentation. If you look in the bottom center of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Feel free to enter your questions in that chat box during the Q&A. We will post the slides and the recording link afterwards on our blog site, which you can find at www.construction-institute.org/blog. Today we welcome consulting firm Alvarez & Marsal, one of CII's newest members. Alvarez & Marsal is a global consulting firm of more than 4,000 employees. The firm has led transformations at thousands of global corporate clients in their journey to restructure, turn around, strengthen their balance sheets, and boost performance. They are widely known for directing the two largest bankruptcies in the world, Lehman Brothers and Washington Mutual. Thank you very much for joining us. Riz, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing okay in your neck of the world. My name is Riz Shah, and I'm a part of the Infrastructure Capital Projects practice at A&M. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity and privilege to engage with you, and it's a very important discussion. In this next hour or so, we hope to share with you how other organizations are handling incredibly difficult decisions regarding their teams, balancing the requirements to meet the short-term priorities, for many of which is cash preservation, as well as long-term objectives for a prosperous future. And we hope that today's forum will provide us all the opportunity to learn from one another as well, because we're definitely all in this together. Well, it goes without saying that the crisis has impacted all of us in unprecedented ways. Many of us are trying to work virtually to generate value for our employers, of course, stay gainfully employed and productive, while managing our home lives that have been disrupted in a way that none of us could have imagined just at the new year. However, unfortunately, with the construction industry being the oldest in the world, ultimately there's a limit in terms of how much we can work remotely from a physical standpoint. And from a commercial standpoint, all of us have ongoing projects as well as planned projects, and decision makers are looking at those first in terms of changing their previous decision. The question is why? Well, between the last 10 or 15 years or so, the construction industry has exploded. There's just no other way to say it. The global construction industry has crossed $1 trillion per annum just 10 or 15 years ago. And very recently, spend of construction in the U.S. has crossed $1 trillion. That means that not only is there more being spent on construction volume, but projects getting larger, more complex, and more expensive, and therefore a greater proportion of risk on the balance sheet of many businesses. So when uncertainty rears its ugly head, as we've seen in the past couple of months, the first line item that gets the axe, unfortunately, is capital expenditure. Ongoing projects are now being re-examined to see if they've been mothballed or commitments can be delayed or stopped, and planned projects are shelved immediately to preserve and avoid future spending. In addition to project shutdowns, we continue to be buried every day by unprecedented challenges in the world around us that are forcing all employers, owners, operators, contractors, and suppliers to make those tough decisions that no one wants to make. Decisions that can indicate that there'll be no growth and no room for optimism in the future. Decisions that can impact livelihood and families of so many. So before we talk about how to address these workforce challenges that require unprecedented levels of engagement management, let's quickly touch on what makes our current environment so unique. Firstly, the travel ban and stay-at-home directives by state and local authorities. While in most areas, fortunately, construction is considered a critical service that may continue, many in management, or those that are writing the checks, are not able to, definitely causing some pause in a number of instances, impacting the productivity of projects. The global recession is all around us, with oil prices dropping to unprecedented levels, all due to decreased consumption. Major project owners and developers continue to cut into immediate and future capital expenditure plans. employee safety and social distancing, whether it's reducing the workforce that's able to work on site or personnel missing work due to health concerns, it's certainly impacting productivity and cash flow. And there's probably no other industry in the world that depends on multiple supply chains and coordination than our construction industry. And what we're not dealing with is just consistent delays and impacts from production across the world, but also the inconsistency in delivering products that's impacting all of our plans from all facets and for all trades. In terms of legal, there is certainly tremendous uncertainty about how it's going to be handled, and numerous questions remain. Will any business interruption be covered by insurance companies? Will employees risk legal action because of exposure to the virus? How will force majeure ultimately be addressed? And are companies going to continue spending in the hopes that some of the financial future may or may not be mitigated? And lastly, technology. Honestly, I think our industry has had a lack of fluency in technology. The construction industry has long been the slowest adopter of technology, just behind the government sector. And while they say that disruption is the driver for innovation, I would argue that our industry has struggled with just evolving consistently around the world, let alone innovating in a way that so many other industries around us have. But this crisis has undoubtedly forced us to look at things in different ways of working. And we're going to be looking at using mobile devices and virtual capabilities for coordination and production. And maybe here's an opportunity for CII and all of us to bring some alignment across all the players in the construction industry. With that, let's turn our attention briefly to some of the easy metrics that are publicly available to give us an idea of this unprecedented and quick change events. As you can see here, we've identified some of the major players that had to literally slash their 2020 capital expenditure budgets just in the past couple of weeks. That's roughly $30 billion in white clean, slowing or stopping projects and jobs that were planned for 2020 that are no longer going to continue. These reductions may continue to grow over the next few weeks and months, particularly this past week with what happened with oil prices. But with companies continuing to announce their capital reductions each and every day, the crisis continues can be expected. And from our past experience, we found that it's common to see that the percentage reduction in headcount that can equate to roughly 50% of the CapEx reduction. So for example, a company that reduces 20% in capital expenditure can be expected to reduce about 10% of the total headcount as well. Therefore, the impact of these reductions on both projects and stakeholders simply cannot be underestimated at all. Taking all this into account, we would now like to turn our attention to looking more closely at how these things are impacting our people and how we can more effectively manage this challenging process. With that, I'll hand it off to Ryan to talk more about the challenges we see around human capital. Ryan?
Thanks, Riz. On this page, we show the top challenges we're facing around human capital. We need to put our people first in these kinds of times of crisis, and having a clear strategic plan focused on our people is going to be essential to effectively leading our workforces in these times. So even though most or all of these challenges are relevant to any industry right now, they're particularly true within construction and energy, and oil and gas in particular. The way that an organization approaches each of these will probably make or break them through this crisis and their ability to recover following it. We're going to dive into each of these 10 challenges to explain why we believe they're so relevant right now, what you can do to adequately prepare and react to the hurdles. With that, I'm going to have Fez Kambavi first go and talk with us about what must be done to provide a safe workplace.
Thank you, Ryan. Very excited. This is Fez. Very excited to be here to speak to you this afternoon. And I think there was a previous webinar done just around safety in the workplace. And for those of us that operate in this capital intensive industry, we know that providing safety is paramount. But now with this new pandemic, it's created new policies, new guidelines, and completely shifted the way we do our work today. With 3 months ago, the OSHA guidelines and rules to operate equipment means having different hygienic practices and monitoring the regular interactions that we have with, the folks that we work with. So the first part we need to look at is, how do your current HR policies support the current needs? These HR policies should reflect your employees' ability to take paid sick leave or work from home if they're able. If employees are required to travel for work, you should be able to be monitoring that travel and interactions that they've had following that. And with the support functions like contractors and folks that are, let's say, working on a rig or actually doing the work on site, we definitely need a plan for addressing how they're going to be interacting moving forward. And we've seen some companies, that are putting in practices to sanitize equipment, and it's costing them more money now and more effort to be able to do this just to be able to provide a safe workplace. In other cases, at my current client right now, we had a group of 20 contractors working on a rig inspection site, and they were escorted off the property because they weren't following social distancing rules. So while we know that these practices and guidelines are new, it is very real, and people are taking these rules very seriously. Many have structured or restructured the way they operate cafeterias, having different shift hours so people can eat at times. And then there's plexiglasses when there's social interaction or some kind of close proximity required. We're putting in plexiglasses and using different kind of equipment to make sure work can be done and operated on a safe basis. So moving forward, it's critical that each company take these policies seriously and continue to provide a safe workplace for all their employees. If we shift focus to why is leadership important, leading with empathy is paramount more than it's ever been. We know with the current economic environment, it's very easy to get distracted by the sheer loss of CapEx that's been reduced over the first quarter, but the need now to really put people first is critical. For a majority of employees, this is an unprecedented time of anxiety and stress around job security, market volatility, their personal finances, and just how to juggle their work and day-to-day jobs, while working from home. Leadership must act as a support system under these circumstances in order to maintain a productive and engaged workforce. Treating employees and paying attention to how people are communicating and monitoring their well-being is going to be key. But the way to be able to operationalize this in their day-to-day, they can build a network of teams. They can empower their current managers to act as crisis managers. They also can start to, if they aren't already operating in a more nimble, agile way, they can start shifting their focus to work in a rapid decision-making type mode where you're navigating new and changing priorities with limited time to react. So some small investments in support and coaching can go a long way in boosting your leader's effectiveness. We've talked about treating employees with empathy. And then lastly, which I'll get into in a bit more detail, is the importance to really communicate transparently. Right now, there's so much misinformation and a level of distrust. So it is critical for leaders to be able to communicate information that is forthcoming, transparent, and easy to digest for their workforce. When we think about communications, I think everybody thinks, it's maybe one stakeholder, or maybe one stakeholder deserves maybe a higher touch than others. What we've seen, companies that are doing this really well are factoring in the individual needs of each of the different stakeholder groups. What you see on the slide are what we believe the 5 key groups that each leader must factor in when it comes to communicating effectively. Number 1 are your crisis management teams. These are the folks that are the task forces that you've established that the workforce is looking to for updates around the pandemic. Communicating with employees must be consistent, and where and how communication is deployed also is equally critical. Creating a cadence that employees can count on, whether it be every Tuesday or Friday of the week, is equally as important. And this, especially if your company does not have an internal communications team, a crisis management team should be able to provide those regular updates as the main source of information for your employees. You should also consider how you are communicating with those outside the organization, like customers and shareholders. And in doing so, you are focusing not only on what's important, but being transparent around what the company is doing on managing and navigating through this unprecedented time. This is an opportunity to reinforce long-term fundamentals, not selling or building new business, and communication should focus on what's important. Additionally, consider being proactive in your communities, like providing resources for those in need, and that you have a consistent message to local media. I think with Exxon, we've seen they have boosted their production for isopropyl alcohol, from providing first responders and nurses garments, masks. So that's just one way Exxon is leading the charge around how to, it's not just about taking care of your employees, your shareholders, they've also got a duty to the community. And I think for those of us that are in Houston that have gone through Harvey, and we've seen in times of crisis, what really is amazing is how communities are able to come together. And while each individual may be impacted differently, at the end of this, or at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And it's critical that as an oil and gas community, while the economics of how we're impacted might be shared, but they are things that each of us can proactively do to be able to support and empathize with one another. Transitioning to now this new way of working has required several non-essential, or even most of the workforce has moved to working virtually. Well, we wanted to share that, you know, working virtually may have its challenges within itself, but creating a culture when you're working in that remote environment to be able to have that same collaboration and, you know, innovation that comes from meeting face to face and in person, and the ability to just, you know, walk to the other side of the cube and ask a question. Given that you can't do that, how can you still maintain productivity as an employee whilst working from home, where you've got a dog or your kids are playing, and while you're homeschooling? How do you navigate this new normal? We wanted to share our version of what we think are the 10 top tips. So number one, companies should consider having a shared support services where employees can do some self-service and be able to access resources where we've got LifeWorks that provides dependent care if your parent is sick. You can also partner with childcare companies that will be able to provide a nanny on demand service. So companies should consider and look into these concierge type services to offer their employees so that they can continue to be productive at work while still managing things that are going on at home. Two, given that we're now working in this virtual work from home, shelter in place environment, a lot of employees can feel disengaged. So how do you still create that feeling of belonging and sense of connectedness with the rest of your teams? So we encourage, for those of you that are operating on some kind of cadence, to also block formal time for virtual conversations and virtual meetings to take place. Number three, this was already a trend that we were trending towards around how important it is to monitor your employees' vitals, either formally through your HRIS or your HR systems, but now you can even do that informally through check-ins, and as leads or anyone that's in a supervisory role, it's more critical for you to have a pulse on each of your teams, a pulse on their overall well-being. Because in this remote environment, you can feel very quickly, you can feel burnout. A lot of people think the concept of working from home allows you that flexibility, but it also, with everything else going on, individuals can very quickly fall in this slum of feeling more burned out and feeling that fatigue of just working from home. As supervisors, it's critical to also continue to manage the one-on-ones. Typically, if you had, like, say, an open door policy where folks could come in, ask a question, they may not feel as comfortable doing that now in this new virtual environment. So important to have formally blocked time, if possible, to meet one-on-one, to be able to really get a pulse on your employee and your team's well-being. This is something that I know the larger organizations may be a bit more concerned about. At Chevron, I remember we used to have ergonomic chairs, desks, and we used to have this software on our computers that would basically, if we weren't clicking too much or not taking breaks as often, it would give us a reminder. That's some of the joys that we have when we have a mature setup where you've got software that manages that. I think for majority of clients and majority of the folks that are on this line may not have that kind of mature software that's being able to prompt you to tell you to sit up straight or maybe slow down and not type so fast. So it's critical when you set up your home office. If you haven't done that already, some companies are allowing their staff to come to the offices and pick up their monitors or the chairs and bring them back to their home workspace so that they can still continue to be productive from home. I think the collaboration tools, several of you are already hopefully accustomed to using some of these, but it's more prevalent that for all of us to be able to learn how to use these technologies, be able to mute lines when we're not speaking, and to be able to manage large teams on these platforms to where when you're storing documents, it's organized and you're able to change or monitor progress for each of your team's priorities and tasks through some kind of a tool, whether that be Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, Slack, Monday, Asana. There's several tools out there that have been out there even prior to this pandemic. It's just now this new virtual working environment has made it all the more critical for the entire workforce to adopt those kind of tools. With this new working from home environment comes the added pressure of, do I need to be online all day? Do I need to send my boss an email in the morning? So I think as leads, establishing some norms around how individuals are getting their work done. We understand that in a dual income household and the kids still need to be getting their homework done, some teams are allowing that flexibility to be able to do that during the day and be more outcome based with what you're actually delivering from a work perspective. So even if you're able to work later at night and respond to emails, just having that expectation clearly outlined with your direct line of supervision is going to be all the more important in this virtual workplace. Similarly, while you may have collaboration tools where tasks and priorities can be maintained, the ability to be clear around guidance around what is truly critical to be done today versus in the future, that guidance also needs to be clearly communicated from each supervisor. And lastly, providing your teams, the teams that don't feel as connected. I think right now, I've personally experienced this as well, where you have your direct team that you may collaborate with and the folks that you have to speak to. But typically it was the other faces and folks that you would be able to catch up with that wasn't happening now, given this new virtual place. So it's important to still have informal channels where you can still keep up with employees. Some of you may be just picking up the phone and calling those individuals, but if there's a Facebook workplace or a discussion board or a chat tool like Skype for Business used, it's important to just check in on each of your colleagues to be able to still have that sense of belonging as part of a large engaged workforce, because it can feel very lonely when you're working in isolation in a virtual environment. So we wanted to spend a bit of time to share what we think are the best practices. Now we can get into some of the more, you could say, technical human capital related activities. So with that, I'm going to transition to Teal to give us some best practices on how we can enable supervisors.
Thanks, Fez. So we know that at the forefront of frontline leaders' minds right now are the health and safety of their teams and the successful execution of their projects. We also know that in times of extraordinary crisis and change, leaders and teams are disoriented from delivering different work products in different ways, and they struggle to keep people connected, especially now in a virtual environment, as Fez was just talking about. So our research from BTS shows that there are 4 critical steps to shifting leaders' mindsets and enabling them to lead through times of change and crisis. And behind each of these steps is a set of specific interventions and experiences designed to increase leader readiness and the sustainability of mindset shift. So first, leaders must be disrupted. And I think we can all agree that we are currently in an extreme state of disruption right now. All leaders, but especially frontline leaders or supervisors, need to reimagine the impact of these disruptions and leverage them as opportunities to create new ways of working together and to use them as a rallying cry for transformation. Second, we have to shift mindsets. So if you want to click to the next build, we have to help our supervisors evolve in their roles and explore new ways of executing. So for many, this means shifting their mindset from I'm an engineer with a linear project plan to I'm an innovator with intelligent work processes that improve productivity and collaboration. Third, supervisors have to help their teams live in this next normal by removing barriers and moving from optimizing for schedule and costs to optimizing for resiliency and efficiency. In order to lead their teams efficiently and build resilience, supervisors must intimately know what it is that only they can do, and they must be able to remove barriers for their teams. Finally, all the work prior to this point will not take root if you don't reinforce these behaviors by providing the social and structural supports and tools that leaders need in their flow of work. So to address these challenges and enable their frontline leadership, our clients, who are some of the largest oil and gas, OFS, and EPC companies in the world, are demanding practical, on-the-job tools and exercises, affordable frontline coaching, and bite-sized learning content that supervisors can use in the field, in the flow of work, to equip them to find new sources of confidence and competence in the face of change. So most recently, my team has been working with approximately 5,000 supervisors of a major oil and gas company to cascade a practical set of exercises that are designed to help supervisors identify and restore that which is in their control, remove barriers to performance for themselves and their teams, change their mindsets and break out of their rivers of thinking, and create a common language around uncertainty, change, and change readiness. So for this particular client, our approach took the shape of a very simple interactive PDF booklet of exercises designed to be done in less than 30 minutes that could be used by individuals or teams anywhere in the world in the moment of need without any preparation. For other clients, we've leveraged our extensive digital platforms for the same purpose. In both cases, each bite-sized module also set up a series of experiments for these supervisors to go try in service of the new behavior, skill, or mindset, and also provided a set of additional resources. So at the end of the day, we know that our frontline leaders are the key to any company's success. And when frontline leaders are able to learn and adapt in the face of uncertainty, they will thrive because they will begin to see change as normal, constant, and filled with opportunity, as opposed to something to be feared and avoided. With that, Ryan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Teal. For sure, enabling frontline supervisors is important because in any of the economic downturns we've seen, we've learned those supervisors with high emotional intelligence and strong soft skills, they're basically recession-proof. There's probably lots of HR program changes that are being considered in your organizations today, and it can quickly become overwhelming to address all those policy changes without a way to prioritize them. We don't want to boil the ocean here. So whether the question is who to give retention incentives to, or which jobs need to be protected, or where to focus, say, workforce planning efforts, you're going to want to focus your initial efforts on what we refer to at Alvarez & Marsal as the critical workforce segments. Those are those roles in the organization that are extremely important to the success of the strategy, and they're very difficult to replace because those skills are scarce in the labor market. So you'll notice those are the two axes we have on the graph here. You'd find those critical workforce segments located in the upper right-hand corner of the graph on this page. But chances are what qualifies as a critical workforce segment today will be pretty different than it was 6 months ago. In particular, if you're dealing in oil and gas or transportation or leisure, you name it, a lot of change is occurring very rapidly. So with this graph, Fez, if you can advance it, what we show in the gray dots here are what the unconventional oil and gas industry was considering to be their critical workforce segments just only 6 to 12 months ago. 6 months ago, there was a big push in the oil and gas industry for production growth and skills in the engineering areas like drilling, completions and construction, facilities management. Those were high demand, short supply. But today, budgets for growth capital being slashed, extensive layoffs of engineers in those areas being announced almost every week. Those roles are quickly becoming part of the flexible labor pool as that talent scrambles for not unemployment, but for employment. In engineers specializing in operations excellence, those are going to be even more crucial to business success in the near future in the oil and gas industry anyway, because the focus is going to be almost exclusively on improving operating efficiencies above all else. So don't make the mistake of focusing attention exclusively on those roles that have been important in the past, or exclusively on top management, or exclusively on high potentials. Really go back and question yourselves about what those critical workforce segments will be for the next 6 to 12 months, and focus your efforts there. Can you advance? Okay, there we go. That's kind of the way everything's moving for those particular groups of what were the critical workforce segments just a short time ago. Can you go to the next slide? And let's just talk quickly about retention. Once you've identified the business's critical workforce segments and identified any other high potential and top performing athletes in the organization, you may want to consider putting a retention plan in place for them. Assuming your high potentials are highly engaged, it's a common mistake because typically these employees set an incredibly high bar for their organizations. They work harder and often smarter than their peers, and it's likely that they expect their organizations to treat them well by providing them with interesting work or lots of recognition, compelling career paths, chance to benefit financially if the organization does all of those things. So when the organization's struggling, like most are right now, your star players can be the first to be disappointed. And as a result, when organizations cut back and ask employees to tough it out, the stars will be the first to say, no thanks. I'd rather find an employer who appreciates my high level of contribution. So an important thing here is that one size does not fit all when it comes to retention strategies. For example, high performing baby boomer, nearing retirement, less likely to be interested in taking on an amazing new opportunity. A cash bonus they can stick into their retirement funds probably going to resonate a lot more with them. Whereas your fresh graduates, your millennials, they may not be as financially motivated. In fact, most of the research shows that they're going to be more interested in learning through stretch assignments to help develop their career skills and grow their career than they are strictly looking at financial incentives. So organizations shouldn't underestimate the value of those non-financial elements of retention programs. Even the relatively simple act of making job openings in the company transparent to the workforce can go a long way to improving job satisfaction and engagement for some of the demographic groups. Now, organizations with mature talent organizations, and I'll use Shell as an example here, Shell Oil, they really focus on the employee experience and are paying careful attention to employee satisfaction. And the way they do that, they've appointed career stewards who meet regularly with their emerging leaders. They assess their level of engagement, help them set realistic career expectations, and they make sure they're getting the right development opportunities by encouraging rotation through various development assignments. They basically force and impose that into the organization. So not just the financial incentives, very much focused on the career and skills development aspect and the opportunities for the employees. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so many employers are looking for alternatives to reducing labor costs in an attempt to avoid layoffs. And these measures are really designed to be temporary in the event the economy snaps back sooner than later. And so each of these options, among others, things like 401k match, eliminating that, should be considered before moving to a reduction in force. Really because of the potential for litigation, the cost to retrain and redeploy, not to mention the loss of critical skills and institutional knowledge. So try to pull as many of these levers as you can before contemplating a headcount reduction. Some of the approaches listed here, bring various benefits, also drawbacks. The options like furloughs, pay cuts, reduction in hours, you're going to get an immediate cost saving, but you can also employ, hiring freezes, deferred comp for executives, reducing your contingent labor are easy ways to implement some cost retainment. And I'm sure you've seen the press announcements recently citing significant executive pay cuts as well as across-the-board salary cuts for the broad-based employee population. Based on what we're seeing in the market, organizations have pulled several of these levers in the last couple of months, but given the current state of things, headcount reductions might be unavoidable for companies to survive in the future. And so the next slide is really an overview on how you manage a reduction properly should an organization need to go in that direction. So, to start on the concept of managing a reduction in force, I'd like to start by saying that the process itself is very important, not only to minimize your legal exposure, but your reputation in the market, as well as your credibility to the remaining employee group that's going to have to endure and engage after the event and support the company through these difficult times. So some key principles are that leadership needs to be visible and present before, during, and after a reduction in force. The process needs to be done with compassion and dignity. Doing things the right way doesn't have to slow down the process. As all you guys are experts in, it just takes proper project management and proper planning. Losing a job is kind of as personal as it gets, and there's no way to minimize or depersonalize ending someone's employment. Layoff notifications, the actual message needs to be delivered personally and by a member of management or some level of authority in the organization. And just kind of overarching is, remember, layoffs impact the whole organization. Obviously those leaving, but also those who stay. And leaders need to be helping people through this time and quickly engage what we call the survivors and help provide direction. So if reduction in force is your best alternative and unavoidable, then the first thing is to determine its scope and establish an overall cost reduction goal. And this should be tied to your strategy for sizing the company to meet the new reality of business. So forecasted projects put on hold, projects that have been canceled in the future, these help determine the appropriate sizing of your organization, both your field as well as your support or back office function. So get your arms around that first. And so step one is about target setting and scoping. So get a handle on your organization and the overall employee baseline costs, develop clear goals and governance as a management team for the reduction. And organizationally, there might be key cost opportunities that just get decided that inevitably release a group of employees. For instance, let's say you shut down a particular region or an office, or a decision to get out of a particular line of business, there's going to be a group of employees that would go with that decision. But once those organizational decisions are made and you've looked at your operating model, and now it's really the time for the departments and functions to begin shaping their new model with a critical eye towards leaning out the organization most effectively without disrupting the current business and maintaining overall safety. So you should size your organization based on the new demands of the business. Benchmarking can help with determining overall sizing. But additionally, management really needs to scrutinize how and what things get done. And are they required or are they nice to have? What are the processes that you've adopted over time that don't make sense anymore, or people aren't using the information or reports? So step one is all about designing the future state organization, supporting functions. It's about positions at this point in the process, not people. And a budget for the reduction in force should be established to include costs for outplacement and severance, et cetera. Your next step, once you got a handle on that, is assessment and selection. So once that structure is developed, now it's time to identify the selection criteria that'll be used to determine who would actually be let go. And this criteria, it's got to be business related, it's got to be objective, and all employees should be assessed in this process. So certain positions where there's a single incumbent and the position is being eliminated, well, that's obvious. But in situations where you're adjusting down the number of employees in a particular role, that's where assessment is key. So be consistent in the selection and application of your assessments. Step three is about final selection. Management should all weigh in. I think, it's always been helpful for the entire executive team to really see who's going to be impacted and how it's going to be impacted and what the trade-offs are going to be. So at this point, the final decisions are going to need to be reviewed by your outside counsel to address any exposure or risk with the impacted group. And it's this time that you need to develop your overall execution plan for reduction. Who, what, where, when, as well as putting together the teams that will absorb the responsibilities moving forward. Step four is about just executing the reduction. In this climate of social distancing, it really prevents face-to-face dialogue in person. That's typically preferred when delivering a message like this, but you can still host individual meetings. Managers should follow a script and perform a notification just like they were in the office, and HR should help them and support them and help pivot the employee to what's next in their life. Right now, employees will likely have questions about unemployment benefits, COBRA, other policies. It can get very confusing. They're going to be under stress, and so they're going to need a lot of support. And so kind of to close, I mentioned in the beginning, the process is so important. And so doing the right things doesn't have to slow down the process. You don't want to shortchange it. And once it's complete, it's going to be about re-engaging the workforce post-reduction. So if you'll go to the next slide, this is about retaining institutional knowledge, and with schools closed, every parent, myself included, has been required to step up as a teacher. And many of us are homeschooling and having to learn mobile applications and worksheets and other things, and really learn to be a teacher on the fly while also doing our own job. I personally have renewed appreciation for the teaching profession. It's similar when people leave the organization. It's easy to attribute low productivity or performance on lack of documentation, training, or access to content. So knowledge-based portals or tools that make documentation accessible, those things that were considered a nice to have in the past are pretty critical need today in this environment. So there are four kind of key areas that we suggest you focus on and have a strategy around to embrace the new normal and help employees be successful. First, a document management or content management system where employees can search and access information through a self-service model is going to be really important. Second, making sure you have documentation and checklists and RACI charts, roles and responsibilities, process documentation, all those kinds of things will be very helpful to help onboard and reskill remaining employees. Employees that may not have had visibility on how to perform those activities in the past. Third, having a formally documented onboarding and knowledge transfer plan, with accountability milestones is a way to ensure that the information and processes are getting to what we call the catcher individual, the person catching the new process and having to perform it in the future. Having someone manage and track that will be very important. And then finally, creating a knowledge sharing culture. It can't be done overnight, but you should work to encourage individuals to contribute to the growth and development of their peers and share information. Cross-training would be very critical with working different shifts or planning for absenteeism or dealing with those employees that are going on furlough. So forming teams to develop these tools, processes, and plans, that can be a good way to re-engage the survivors after a reduction, get them looking on how work gets done and how to document their own work in the new normal. Teal alluded to it, getting managers to kind of corral and pull together their existing teams and figure out how to work effectively together will be important as we move forward. And that's, with that, I'll turn it back over.
So at this time, I know some of you have sent some questions in the chat. We wanted to leave the last 10 minutes for some Q&A. Again, you can feel free to unmute your lines, or, what's preferred is just so we can be able to address questions in an organized fashion. We would prefer if you would just put it in the chat. I think based on questions that have already come in, I'm going to tackle or basically repeat them for the facilitators. So how do we motivate or balance between a RIF and remote working to keep everyone on task? Kevin, do you want to tackle that one? Or Teal, do you have a perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to share my perspective. So I would say there's a couple of things to take into consideration. Most importantly, we talked about at the very beginning is having that empathy. So really walking in your employees' shoes to understand what they're feeling as they see their friends, their colleagues, their team members perhaps lose their jobs. So recognizing what they're feeling from that perspective, and also understanding that they probably have some fear in them as well. So creating a space for them to acknowledge those emotions is very important. Simultaneously, it's critical for supervisors and their supervisors to continue to build trust with their teams during these times by being as transparent and authentic as possible. So certainly there is confidential information that you cannot share at these times, but at least saying to your teams, look, this is what's happening. This is what I can share with you. As I get more information that I can share, I will share. And just letting them know that they are heard and that you see them and understand what they're going through is critical for continuing to build trust and helping people stay focused on their work.
Thank you, Teal. Another one that we came in, I'm assuming, Praveen, your question was answered around how should we take care of retention and deployment, and similar to the question that was raised, around what is the best way to retain employees during this pandemic. I'm assuming Ryan covered that. The other question is, how do you deal with vulnerable employee population requirements in regard to HIPAA privacy guidelines?
And Fez, are you talking about from a manager's perspective, or leaning on human resources and pushing that to them to handle?
Joseph Martucci, do you want to elaborate?
Hi. The employees returning to work is a certain population that have underlying health conditions that may not be readily available to a manager or a supervisor, and the government guidelines indicate that you have to handle that population differently. So how will a company deal with transmitting that information to a manager that this particular employee is a vulnerable population type?
I don't see this, Paul. This is Paul Donovan. I don't see this any different as being a manager for supervisor for 30 plus years. We always have some situations that are between the employee and supervisor. If it's out of policy, then you'll have conversations. But I think you don't want folks that are immunocompromised, and I've got some of those employees, and I've also got employees that are going through the same challenges some of you talked about before, with kids at home and don't know if childcare or camps will be open this summer, right? So we're gonna have to work through that as managers, employees, and I think the more we treat that individually, then the more in person, I think is the big. It helps with that loyalty that Ryan was talking about before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think an exercise of, we call it understanding your employees' currency or their situation, really. There's we're gonna have to be a lot more open and communicative to our employee base to really understand where they're at, what their needs are, and almost on the retention side, develop some real fit for purpose kind of solutions for them is during this period.
Thank you.
There's another question, and a bit off topic, but I think a good one nonetheless, because it's, I think, trying to raise how can we better use robotics. So I'll repeat it for everyone. What are your thoughts on how would advanced construction robotics, for example, built-in cranes, be advantageous in the time of labor shortage and the risks to labor safety?
Yes, this is Riz. So I'd say obviously very advantageous. I think we all know that where robotics have played a role in the industry is when there has already been concerns regarding personal safety, toxic substances, going in sort of disaster recovery situations, that sort of thing. I would say though, for by far large amount of project situations, crane operators fortunately are operating at a bit of a distance. So I think it absolutely can play a role and should. I think it's a great example of how we need to start leveraging different ways of working. I know there's a number of organizations right now exploring how they can work differently, kind of different ways of working, that sort of thing. So I think it certainly play a role, but as we all know in our industry, just to start doing things differently on existing job sites, it does take time, and that needs to be assessed as well.
Thanks, Riz. Another question, I think this came in email before, around are corporate policies, practices, and protocols around projects being updated during this time period? And the answer is absolutely. HR policies are being updated to be obviously be able to reflect the new normal. And OSHA's pushing out new guidelines. There's even things where if an employer's made an effort to create an environment, because working on an offshore rig, there's only so much you can do around social distancing and kind of creating that space, because there's narrow hallways, et cetera. So organizations are trying to do the best they can, but there's also OSHA clauses that protect employers, that they've done whatever they can, or a best effort estimate, to create a safe workplace. And it's not basically them being negligent on safety. I think the more key thing is employers have to take an active role in actively monitoring and doing things to stay ahead of the virus. I mean, we're putting in pre-screening and before people even get on site to a facility to do temperature checks to see if they're showing symptoms, so that you can obviously not contain or spread the virus. So thank you all for joining. I know we've got 1 minute left. As Mike had mentioned early on in the presentation, this webinar is being recorded, so it can be accessed after, and the slides and the content that's been shared will be shared with everyone. If you're curious about who presented today, we did have a slide for bios at the front of the deck that encourage anyone to, if you've got follow-up questions or queries from anyone from A&M or from BTS, feel free to go to the key contacts at the end of the slide deck. And with that, Mike, again, thank you for the opportunity, and appreciate everybody joining this afternoon.
Thanks, Fez. Thank you to you, Riz, Ryan, Kevin, and Teal, all for sharing information with us. This is really good. And thank you all, the audience, for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for your forbearance with the technical issue. And this concludes our webinar for today. Stay safe and goodbye for now.